Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to share my top tips that I like to use when I'm working from a low quality photo for my pet portraits. So this was a tutorial that was requested by a couple of Patreon members because as pet portrait artists it's one of the things that we are often faced with. The reference photo is really important, so ideally we'd like to make sure that the references that we are working from are the best quality that we can get. But there are instances where that's just not possible. Maybe unfortunately if the animal has passed away, the photos were taken on an old phone maybe. There are many things that are going to affect the quality of that photo. So I do have some tips and techniques that I like to use in these instances so that I can make my artwork more realistic than the reference photo. Now the one thing that I'll mention before I get onto my top tips is that I do approach these kinds of portraits slightly differently. I make more decisions in the moment based on the references that I've got in front of me. So because of that, I made this tutorial on Patreon all in real time. So the nearly 6-hour version is available over there. If you would like to draw Barney, the reference photo and the line art are also provided. And as I say, all of that tips, the techniques, exactly what I'm doing at the time and why I'm doing it is all in that tutorial. So if my Patreon channel is of use, I'll link that in the description below. So my first tip, and that is good lighting. Now this is something that I talk about a lot in all of my tutorials, and it brings me on to contrast. With the reference photo that I had here of Barney, it was one that I took on a very old mobile phone. The quality in terms of the fur detail was not ideal, but the lighting was nice. It had a light source more from one side, so I could see more of where those highlights and shadows needed to be. That gave me a really good foundation to then add more of my details in those areas. I knew where I had to add more of my highlights and where I had to reinforce my shadows. And for me personally, there are guidelines that I like to put in place at the time of taking on a commission. If that reference photo is really dark and it's also low quality in terms of not being able to see the fur direction, that is for me when I make the decision to turn that commission down. As artists, I think we feel like we have to draw everything that we're asked to complete. If you're not happy with the reference photo, you don't feel comfortable taking that on, it is more than acceptable to turn that down in that instance. Tip 2, and that is to have other reference photos. Now that could be other photos of the dog, and I think this is really useful if you are working from a low quality photo. Even if the other photos are no better in terms of the quality, it is a good idea to have a few of that pet so you can get a better idea of the colour, the expression. Maybe let's say if the photo had red eye where a flash was used or something like that, other photos of that dog would give you that eye colour, and you can then use that in your portrait if the photo you've used is a slightly different pose. So that's one thing that I will also do. However, one thing that can be really useful is if you look on royalty-free sites like Pixabay, you can type in the dog, the breed that you're working on, whatever animal it is, horse, dog, cat, and then try and find a reference photo of an animal of a similar colour, the same breed and so on. You can then get a much better quality photo from there, royalty free. You can then use that to add some of the detail in your artwork. Now obviously we are still going to be following our reference photo because of course we want it looking like that animal, but we could then use the detail from the reference photos that we've sourced elsewhere in terms of what the fur texture might be like, where I could add a little bit more detail, the general flow and feel of that fur based on that breed. That's one thing that can be really useful, and it can make the process a lot less stressful when it comes to completing the commission itself. If you are doing that though, always make sure, as I say, that you are still following the light source and what that dog is. So the markings, for instance, the eyebrows here, those ginger spots. If I want to follow along and use the references on Pixabay, for instance, I must make sure that I'm still adding the unique markings that this dog in the reference photo has. You only want to be using the other references that you've sourced yourself just to get a bit more of a feel on the fur detail and the texture and so on. So tip 3, and that is to enhance the reference photo that you are using. Quite often, poor reference photos don't have as good a contrast as we want to capture in our artwork. So if you have a photo editing software or any free apps, hype up the contrast a little bit, maybe adjust the colour saturation to get it a little bit more similar to how other photographs of that animal might be, and then use that as your reference. By hyping up the contrast, and already if you need to adjust in the colour, you may not have to, but sometimes if it is required, it can make a difference. Then you've already got a reference photo that is more sharper. It's going to be more what your artwork is then going to look like. Now, quite often when I design my layouts, I will hype up the contrast slightly, and when I create those layouts so I can pick which background I want and so on, I will then send that edited version to my client with the layout so they can then see how the contrast is going to be slightly altered if needed, and so on. There are many things there that you can adjust in those photo editing apps, and as I've mentioned, it can then make your life a little easier for judging your highlights and your shadows and so on. Now, you can sharpen images, you can try and really enhance them if you need to. Sometimes, depending on how pixelated that image is, it's going to make it worse. It is just going to depend on the reference photo, but you can certainly play around with that as well. So tip 4, and this is something that I do on every instance when I'm working from a poor quality photo, and that is to focus on your artwork far more than the reference photo. It's very easy to spend all of that time like we normally would when we've got a good quality photo, where we're spending more time looking at that reference. What can happen is our brain goes on autopilot and we start drawing it how we see it in that reference photo, and sometimes in some cases our artwork isn't as detailed as it could be. So what I like to do is, once I've got my general lights and darks in that you can see from that reference photo, I then usually put that to the side of me and I'm focusing just on that one section of fur at a time. I start adding in the detail that I know would be there if that dog was sat in front of me. As I say though, I'm still following the lights and darks where that general light source is that I can see in that reference photo, but I'm certainly paying far more attention to the drawing itself rather than spending more time looking at that photo. I do think though that part of it comes with the more dogs that you draw, the more confident you get with the general flow, the fur texture and so on. When I first started taking pet portrait commissions, I usually made sure that every single reference photo I had was a good quality. It might not have been the best quality, but I could see the fur direction detail, and that's usually the basis that I went on when I was first taking commissions. If I could see that detail, I knew then that I would be able to create something realistic in my artwork. So tip 5, and that's to step away from your artwork more regularly. This is something that I think we should do with every portrait, but I do it more when I'm working from a poor quality photo. The reason being, I find myself personally, it can be a little bit more frustrating to create these artworks from a poor quality photo because we don't have the information that we need. We can therefore not be as motivated with that portrait. However, if you keep stepping back from your easel and really taking into account how much more detail we have got in that portrait compared to the reference photo, it's going to help us to continue with that artwork. Also, by stepping back from the easel and really appreciating how much more detailed it is compared to the reference photo, I know that it might not be my best portrait, but I do know it's certainly far better than the reference photo that I was provided with. So tip 6, and that is layering, and this is something that I put a lot of focus on in my Patreon tutorials. I think it's something that's really important. When I'm working from a low quality photo, I will still make sure that I'm putting in as many layers as what's necessary for that one area of fur. Just because it's a low quality photo doesn't mean then that I need to reduce the amount of layers that I'm adding in. If that happens because you can't see the detail, your portrait will just be as flat or as not as detailed as that reference photo, which is obviously not what we want. So when you have got a poor quality photo, still make sure that you're adding in the same number of layers that you would from a good quality photo. That's going to then help to make your portrait more realistic. And this brings me back to one of the tips that I've also mentioned, where it's really important to just trust what you know as an artist. If you've done a few portraits before, that experience that you've got there, you know then to trust that instinct. You know how to layer, you know where your highlights and where your shadows need to be, whether or not your contrast is sharp enough. By making those decisions throughout the process is really going to work in your favour for trying to capture that much more realism in your artwork. Going back to what I mentioned with the eyes and if there was any red eye from a flash or anything like that, it would be very easy to just draw it as round circles, don't have any iris colour, not much of a highlight. But for the portrait here with Barney, I made sure that when the eyes were really dark, I still added in the highlights. I reinforced that ever so slightly. I put a bit more of the iris colour in there and some shadows on the bottom eyelid. All of those details I couldn't see, but I knew that his eye would not be one solid circle in real life. There had to be some degree of colour in the iris. Making those decisions, and as I mentioned, I do think that comes more with the experience, the more portraits that you do. But if you're wanting to try and take on more commissions that are from low quality photos, maybe just do it of your own pets. See how realistic you can get it compared to the reference photo of your own. That's going to just take off all of that pressure. At least then you don't have someone, your client, waiting for that portrait. When you know that you are able to work from low quality photos, you don't then have to put yourself under as much stress because you know what the finished outcome is going to look like. It, as I've said, might not be your best artwork, but it will be better than that reference photo. If I'm asked to create a portrait from a low quality photo and my initial gut instinct is, no, I don't think I'm going to be able to create something that's better than the reference photo or that's going to do it justice, I just will not take on that commission. I think that is the best rule. If you're not happy with it, it's okay to say no. So tip 7, and this is one that I personally like to use, is when I've got a poor reference photo, I won't generally work on a larger scale. The larger the portrait, ideally the better quality photo because you have more space to add more of those tiny details. If you can't see those details to start with in that poor photo, if you're working larger, it is just going to make the process much harder in terms of creating more of a realistic portrait. And this of Barney here was an 8x12, and for me personally, I do just like that size for a single subject when I'm working from a low quality photo. So these are the tips and techniques that I like to use in my own portraits when I am working from low quality photos. And you may have noticed here that I've been really focusing on this top section of Barney's head. In the Patreon version, there is a screen recording tutorial showing you how I've actually corrected this part of his face. What I've done is I've taken a photograph of my artwork and then I took that into my photo editing software and I've shown you the process on how you can then correct parts of your portrait using your computer first. So what I did is in my artwork, I knew that I'd made the top of his head a little bit too broad. Because the reference photo was poor, there was something behind his head which actually made it look wider than it was. I needed to fix that. Now, because he's got the black fur on the side of the head there, you'd think that it was maybe a mistake and you had to start the portrait again. But because pastels are such a forgiving medium, I was able to fix it. And as I say, all of that is shown in the real-time tutorial over on Patreon. And the reason why I did that and I made those changes on my photo editing software first is I couldn't tell whether or not the changes were just that I was focused too much on that one part of the portrait and whether or not I was being a little bit distracted by the fact that I was working from a poor quality photo. So what I wanted to do is before I made changes to my artwork, I wanted to make sure I took a photo of it. I made those changes on the computer. Then if I liked those changes, I knew then that I had to make those alterations on the portrait. So that is a process that can be really beneficial. So as I've said, all of that is available in the Patreon version, which is linked below. So I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this tutorial are useful. If you've got any questions, anything art related, drop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you found this video useful, if you could hit the thumbs up, it really does help. If you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube very soon. And if my slower pastel and acrylic tutorials are of use, my Patreon is in the description below.